In this mini lecture, we'll look at the other selective pressures. You've seen this slide before. In the last mini lecture, we addressed natural selection. Now we'll cover artificial selection, sexual selection, and genetic drift. Artificial selection is the selection of traits by another species, usually referring to humans. A couple other species also artificially select traits, like ants. Some farm a fungus, and some raise aphids as though they were livestock. But we'll focus on humans. When we select traits in another species, we tend to choose just a few traits. For instance, in bananas, we've selected for small seeds and larger fruit. This is a wild banana for comparison. Our domestic bananas actually have non-fertile seeds because they're so small. In general, the traits we select for are usually at odds with natural selection. Non-fertile seeds are not very successful in nature. These traits would generally be selected out of a population in nature. A pug, for example, looks adorable with this little snub nose, its little legs, its rotund body. But these traits do not help the pug survive in nature. If you left a pug in the wilderness, it would probably die in about 5 minutes. Okay, that's an exaggeration, but not much of one. The most amazing aspect of artificial selection is the amount of change that we can make happen. Darwin raised pigeons to see how quickly change can occur in a population. One expert pigeon breeder from Darwin's day stated that he could produce any trait within just a few generations. These are some examples of artificially selected varieties. Corn was artificially selected from the wild teosinte, a grain that grows in Mexico and Central America. The domestic corn now produces seeds at such a high density that it cannot grow unaided without human help. There are no wild corn populations. The wild mustard plant has been modified in many different ways. By selecting for different traits, this plant has evolved by artificial selection into cauliflower, broccoli, cabbage and Brussels sprouts, kale, and kohlrabi. My favorite example of artificial selection is probably the Ancon sheep. If you've ever been to New England, you've probably seen these low rock walls that edge property lines. People who raised sheep preferred this variety since they didn't have to build a taller stone wall. It was easier to make a shorter sheep than it was to build a taller wall. Sexual selection is the selection of certain traits by a mate. These traits can be permanently exhibited, or they may only appear during the reproductive season. They definitely decrease survival by natural selection, since many of these traits are flamboyant, attention-getting, or require large amounts of energy to grow. They tend to increase the risk of predation. Our last selective pressure is genetic drift. This is an entirely random selection event. The traits are not selected for because they are better or worse than any other traits, but rather just because they were in the right place at the right time. Genetic drift usually requires small populations because a small number of individuals is very likely to differ from the larger population. It's like if we have a class of 200 students, on average, let's say they'll be about 5.5 feet tall, but there is variation. If I select 2 students, the odds are pretty high that their average height would not be 5.5 feet tall. So these small populations are basically a sampling error in the variation of traits. There are 2 ways to get a very small population in a location. You could kill off most of the population in its range, or you could move a small number to a new range. The bottleneck effect is a catastrophe that kills off almost all members of a population or species. The survivors didn't survive because they had better traits for that situation. They just happened to be in the right place at the right time. The sea otter is an example. They were killed for their fur. They all have fur and would all have been hunted, but some survived due to luck. A small number of sea otters survived, just 1,000 worldwide. All sea otters today have this really low genetic diversity. The founder effect involves a few organisms getting transported into a new environment. Again, you'll have a very small sample of organisms, so there's a good chance that a rare trait becomes common. One example of the founder effect is in people. From a small group of about 200 Amish immigrants who moved from Europe to North America. One person in this very small group had the trait for polydactyly. There's currently a high rate of polydactyly in this population. It's about 1 in 5,000, but that's compared to 1 in 100,000 in the general population. Now we've covered all 4 types of selective pressures. Let's look at an example to see what type of pressure is applied to this population. If we have a group of bacteria and we take an antibiotic, certain bacteria will survive, resulting in a change in the population's traits. Which type of selective pressure is this? This is natural selection. Many people think that this might be an example of artificial selection because humans are involved. But humans, as a part of nature, can also contribute to natural selection. Remember that natural selection is about traits that survive in a particular environment. Artificial selection is about humans choosing certain traits that we want. We do not want antibiotic-resistant bacteria. We are not selecting for that intentionally. Some people think this is an example of a bottleneck effect. And this does create a bottleneck by killing off most of the population. However, it is not random which organisms survive. So this is not genetic drift. Now that we've seen the different ways selection can occur, let's look at the type of shifts traits can make. For any trait, there is a range of average traits that are found in most organisms and extreme traits. There are fewer organisms with those. A selective pressure could select for average traits, one extreme or the other, or both extremes. Let's draw. We're going to start with a range of traits. Let's say size in rabbits. We have little rabbits over here and very large rabbits over here. In a normal population, there are very few small rabbits, lots of average size rabbits, and a few very large rabbits. The curve looks like this. In environment 1, there are only small predators like foxes. So the larger the rabbit, the better its survival. Over time, these large rabbits pass on their traits and the smallest rabbits do not. The range of traits and the average size will get larger The whole curve moves in one direction. This is called directional selection. We could have a situation where the most average trait is the most successful. That's the starting point. But let's say the extreme traits are least successful. If we have the small predators that get the smallest rabbits, but there's not much food available in this environment to support the largest rabbits, you'll get a switch to the curve that narrows this range. This is called stabilizing selection because it reinforces the average trait and reduces the diversity. Then we have a situation where the average traits are the least successful. Both extreme traits are beneficial. This is called diversifying selection. Diversifying selection is really common because the extreme versions of a trait tend to use different resources. They have the most difference in their niches. In our rabbit example, let's say the habitat has a bunch of different plants. The large rabbits can eat plants of all different sizes. Including very tall plants. They have food available that the average rabbits can't reach, so they're benefited. The small rabbits can eat very small plants that were overlooked by the large rabbits, and they can survive on very little food, especially any bits that remain after the others have eaten. The average rabbits are competing for most of the food. In this situation, which is an example of resource partitioning, the big rabbits can eat these foods and the small rabbits can eat these foods. This eventually results in a speciation event. The most extreme or most different traits are selected for. So the organisms will end up in different niches, will stop breeding together, and they will speciate. Now let's look at this other example. In this case, the range of traits is fur color, from light to dark. In directional selection, one or the other trait would be selected for. Let's say the mice are nocturnal, so the darker colored mice would be more successful. Stabilizing selection would result in a light brown color mouse, the average. That might be an environment like the forest floor with lots of dead leaves. And diversifying selection results in two different populations of mice, one with very light colored fur and one with very dark colored fur. This last one is a real life example. In the deserts of Arizona, there are light-colored sands. There are also areas of ancient lava flows, which are very dark. So even though these mice are nocturnal, owls can easily pick out the mouse color that does not match its background. So dark mice stay in the lava flow. Light mice stay on the sands. We've also already learned about a real-life example of directional selection, that poisonous newt and the garter snakes, which benefited by producing more and more toxin or more and more resistance to the toxin. And a real example of stabilizing selection is birth weight. Most human babies weigh about 5 to 9 pounds. Babies born under 3 or 4 pounds have a lower chance of survival, and babies over 10 pounds have more complicated births. Now we've covered selection and variation in the basics of evolution. Let's address just a couple of misconceptions, starting with the phrase survival of the fittest. The word fitness has changed over time. It's evolved. That results in a common misunderstanding of this phrase. Today, fitness refers to how strong or how fast or maybe even how attractive you are. But in the past, fitness referred to how good of a fit you were, like a puzzle piece fitting in a puzzle. With that definition, survival of the fittest just means the survival of the best traits in a particular niche. You don't have to be fast, big, smart, attractive, or strong. You just have to survive well. This means you could be small if the environmental pressures select for the use of fewer resources. The smallest or slowest organism would use the least energy and be most successful. It's simply the best fit in a particular niche or environment. The ubiquity of small organisms and camouflage emphasize this point. It's better to be small than big. And it's better to stay stationary, to stay camouflaged, and be overlooked by a potential predator. Both of these traits have the added benefit of saving energy. Likewise, an adaptation is not something that you intentionally change, like in the phrase adapt or die. That's referring to a behavioral adaptation. You can change behaviors. Evolution, though, is based on genetics, which you cannot change. A genetic adaptation is a trait successful in a particular environment. In other words, it's not something you need to develop to survive. Rather, it's a trait that remains, that was successful after the struggle to survive. An adaptation is just a trait that has been successful in that habitat or niche. One last clarification. Evolution is change over time. It happens through a combination of variation and selection. The term evolution is not interchangeable with natural selection. Darwin is credited with natural selection because he created an over 400-page argument that used deductive reasoning and hundreds of experiments and examples to demonstrate how natural selection occurs. This allowed people to see how evolution could work. He did document that variation exists and that traits are heritable, but other scientists later explained how variation happened. The theory of evolution was and is a group effort that has spanned hundreds of years. Natural selection was Darwin's. And while he didn't have all the pieces to explain all of evolution, his concept of it was later supported. He was right.